Happy Halloween weekend, everyone, from the Shadows podcast. We're here for another episode of Rise from the Shadows. This episode, entitled Vulnerability, has Fresh Lennon himself, George Lennon Jr., on this episode. He is a non-commissioned officer in the United States Air Force. He's an Airman Leadership School Instructor at Ramstein Air Base in Germany, an accomplished spoken word artist. He's an author and a Tedx speaker. On this episode, Fresh Lennon talks about the superpower we possess known as vulnerability. Throughout his life, he suppressed his feelings from being a victim of domestic abuse and sexually assaulted. However, he found his outlet to express his feelings through the power of poetry. He talks about how the power of the spoken word saved not only himself, but one of his fellow airmen. Check out this amazing episode of Rise from the Shadows Vulnerability at theshadowspodcast.com or at our link tree, which is in the description. Also, we have the links for his book, Before the Streetlights Come On, the Breath of Fresh Air Scholarship, spoken word album, and the TEDx video. Folks, enjoy this episode of Rise from the Shadows Vulnerability.
Hey, so I'm Staff Sergeant George Lennon Jr., also known as Fresh Lennon on stage. But I'm stationed at Ramstein. I'm an Airman Leadership School Instructor. And this is the one job I wanted to do while enlisted, absolutely. Just because when I first got to Ramstein, my experience as an ALS student was amazing. My instructor was on point. I just PCS there, and I still was house hunting. I was looking for a car. And my classmates, my instructor, the whole schoolhouse made it an awesome experience. So I always told myself, like, if I get the chance to be an ALS instructor at Ramstein, this is what I want to do. But I've been in for 8 years now. Military brat. My pops was in for 20 years. If you ask him, he'll say 20 years, 8 months, and 6 days. And my older sister served in the Air Force as well. And my brother is in the Navy. He can't swim, but somehow he made it through basic, and he's in the Navy. So we're a military family. And my biggest thing about being in the military is I'm in the military, but despite the uniform, I'm also an artist, and I try to embody both in the classroom. So that's my biggest thing. But yeah, I'm glad to be here. I've seen so much. I've heard so much about this podcast. My coworkers were talking about it when they came from EPME IC. Yeah, and I saw it all over the place. I even listened. You had some people on this podcast that I know, which was pretty awesome to hear some of their stories. And I felt like I knew them really well until I heard this podcast. So I was like, wow, this definitely is a good spot for vulnerability. And that's kind of what I want to hit on today. Is talking about how vulnerability is pretty much a superpower. So a lot of times I ask people, if you could have one superpower, what would you pick? And a lot of times people pick things like, oh, super speed, super strength, or control time, because we all know that time management is something that we can never really manage, but we try. We have the audacity to control time, but we really can't. Invisibility, all these different things. And it's because we've seen superheroes or something in comics or something on TV, them having this superhuman ability. And the reason why I ask this question is because humans, most of the time, we believe that we don't have a superpower already. And I've come to realize while I've been in the Air Force that we actually do have a superpower, and we have 3 special skills. And I'll go through all of these different skills with telling a story about just pretty much me, Senior Airman Lennon to Staff Sergeant Lennon, and the man I am today, in and out of the uniform. So growing up, I have the best parents in the world. Let me start with that. But growing up, we had a household where you couldn't talk about your feelings, let alone if they're sad feelings, because what you got to be sad about? Your parents pay for you to eat, go to school, got clothes on your back, all that good stuff. So where's there to complain about? I remember telling my mom once that I was depressed. She said, I better go depress those dishes. You know, like there was no mental health checks. There was no mental health talks. If I talked to my pops about mental health, I needed to man up. If I needed to talk to my mom about mental health things, it's probably because I wasn't praying enough. I needed to pray it away. And granted, let me say that my parents have grown a lot. They're actually both huge advocates for mental health. But at the time, being groomed this way, where even on television, even in music, even everything media-wise that we paid attention to as kids, mental health was seen as, if you went to go seek help, it's because you needed it because you were crazy or because you couldn't handle what was going on. And growing up this way, I suppressed a lot, where suppression isn't a word that we would really use for what we go through. We would say, oh, well, I meditated, or I prayed about it, or I went through it and I got I went past it. But I've learned recently that I'm really good at suppressing things, dissociating myself, if you will, from problems that I've had. And it wasn't until I got to my second base and I met my supervisor that I realized that that was my issue. And I didn't even realize I had an issue. So I am a sexual assault victim advocate. I've been so for 4 years, just renewed. And I didn't even realize that I was a victim of a lot of sexual assault. I've been in domestically abusive relationships, romantic relationships, and I was molested as a child. And a lot of those things, just suppressed it. Just cool, move past it. And I joined the Air Force with the suppression. It came along with me. And I like to think of a lot of things that depress us or suppress us as kind of like having sandbags on your shoulders. And for those who ever had to do workouts like that, or probably had to do it in basic training or some type of training, it gets heavy after a while, especially after a mile. But if you poke holes in that sandbag, and in this case, talking about these issues, talking about the things you've been suppressing, yeah, you'll leave a trail behind you, but it gets lighter and lighter the more you talk about it, or the more holes you put in it. So I learned when I joined the Air Force that I've actually been through a lot. And I told you, Trip, like at first, I feel like I didn't have a story. I'm good, which is a saying that I've been using my whole life because that's what my pops always told me to say. That's what I've always said. But when I joined the Air Force, I thought I was good. I went to Aviano, my first base. I was in a domestically abusive relationship, and I was good. I blame myself for a lot of things that happened in that relationship, being by the definition of sexual assault, coerced into sex. A lot of things happened to me, but I suppressed it. I'm good. I'm George Lennon. I'm Fresh Lennon. I still go to work with a smile on my face. And then I got to Osan. And for those who don't know about Osan Air Base, Korea, you away from her family, like you away. And we party hard, but we party harder. And we work hard, we work harder, but you gonna party harder than you did all of those things. And I didn't realize, I didn't realize I had an alcohol problem then too. So when you see alcoholic on social media or on TV or on movies, they're always drinking liquor, right? Or beer. There's no alcoholics drinking wine. And me being from Italy, I was stationed there first, so I think I'm a wine connoisseur. I was always drinking wine. And I'm an electrician by trade. So we were doing jobs in the dorms. And I saw on somebody's bed one day that, oh, shoot, they got that sheet on the bed for the first sergeants to come through and check the dorms. And me, hey, man, we need to swing by the dorms, do a job that's over there. And I need to make sure my room is good to go. And this is the day that I realized I had a drinking problem or a depression problem or both. I don't know what you want to call it. But I realized I had so many wine bottles, empty wine bottles in my room, in my small dorm room. And I sent my coworker, I was like, hey, you go check your room, I'll check my room. And I spent so much time bagging up all those bottles to throw away into the trash can. In the first trip, I sounded like a ghetto Santa Claus or something, because it was just, all the bottles was just jingling as I was going down the hallway. So I was like, okay, cool. On trip 2, I'm going to wrap them up in these BX bags that I just had in my room from me buying all the bottles. And while I'm wrapping up the bottles of wine, or the wine bottles, the empty wine bottles, I realized, like, yo, this ain't right. Like, I'm embarrassed to walk down this hallway, because if anybody who's on a different shift hears me, they're like, dang, like, he either partying in his room or he lonely. And I'm not lonely. Again, I'm Staff Sergeant George Lennon. I'm Technical Sergeant George Lennon, George Lennon Sr.'s son. I can't be sad. What I got to be sad about? My parents always took care of me. I went to school. I went to college for a little bit. What I got to be sad about? I'm in the Air Force. I'm happy. But I suppressed so many things leading up to that man that I was there. And it was at that time that I realized I had a problem, which is why I don't drink that much in November. I don't drink that much late October and November, because I know during this season, it gets me. But the magical thing is that I had a supervisor who actually cared. So being on this team where we actually do jobs in the dorms, they made hybrid teams where you're not just working with your work center. So I was an electrician, but I worked with HVAC techs. I worked with structures, plumbers. We worked different career fields just together, and we handled jobs together. So my supervisor was actually structures. And we got in a debate about something on a random day. And he was like, you know what? You need to just come to the open mic and hear my poem about what I'm talking about, because you'll probably understand it better. And I was like, oh, so you write poetry? He's like, yeah, I write poetry. What about you? And I was like, I dabble. I write poems and stuff, because poetry is soft. But if you rap, that's hard. So as a man, at my mind frame at this time, I'm not about to tell another grown man I write poems in my room. So I'm like, yeah, I'll be writing, poems a cappella. So he's like, all right, cool, man. You want to be tough? Cool. Just come to the open mic and hear what I got to say. And I saw this grown man that was super popular around Osan confess what seemed like a confession to me, which was this vulnerability in his rawest form on a stage full of strangers and friends, just out there, talk about his pitfalls, talk about his marriage issues, his mental mindset about being a father on a stage in front of strangers, and people accepted it. They clapped, they snapped, even some people hugged him. I was like, man, I ain't about to go up there and talk about my issues. But it sat with me. I went to my room and I started writing down stuff. I'm like, I ain't gonna say this out loud. But he kept pushing me. And then during that time, he was like, well, what do you care about? Who do you want to be? Like, who's George? Like, I know who Airman Lenin is, but who's George? And I thought about that and I wrote about it. And then finally I went on stage and I just wrote. It wasn't the most vulnerable piece I ever wrote, but I wrote and I spoke to the people, and somebody came up to me and was like, hey man, I'm glad you said that, because I be feeling like that too. Wow. Okay. Dang, like maybe I'm not alone when it comes to something like that. I found my outlet right then and there in that moment. And it was crazy, Trip. I told you that today, my wife and I, we had a little date night and we went to a hookah bar. And the crazy thing about fate, there's a guy that used to go to the open mic all the time. Never got his name. He was really vulnerable. He showed up at the hookah bar today. And I was like, yo, were you in Osan? He was like, yeah. I was like, are you a poet? He was like, yeah. I was like, man, I know you. You used to perform at the old lounge. You was like dropping some heavy stuff. And his face went from being defensive, walking into this bar, not knowing anybody, because he's kind of new to Ramstein, to like, you know me, like, what's up? He stayed with us. I didn't invite him, but it was cool that, he saw us and was like, okay, like at least somebody knows my heart. Somebody seen the real me, what's going on. And he took off his purge mask because it's Halloween time. And we started talking a little bit. But I thought that was awesome that on that stage, I was able to be vulnerable with a bunch of people. And I learned how to, in a way, and I'm not saying poetry replaces therapy in any way, but I learned through my supervisor just caring about me enough to check on me and then invite me out. To a point now, I have this consistent outlet to express myself. And it would be cool. This would be a great story if I was like, yeah, and that's how I, beat suicide, or that's how I beat depression. But what makes this story, in my opinion, amazing is that it's contagious, what my supervisor did. So I continued. I made it out of Osan. and I PCS to Ramstein. I go through ALS and I'm finally a supervisor. I'm like, I'm going to be better than every supervisor that I ever had. I'm going to be just like the supervisor that I had in Osan, care about people. I'm going to be vulnerable. I'm going to give them time, all of that good stuff. And right when I'm done, my supervisor finds out that, hey, you're a victim advocate, right? I was like, yeah, I got certified in Osan. He was like, so you probably did the suicide training and all that stuff. Yes, sir. Cool. We got an airman on suicide watch. So when you graduate ALS, you're going to be his supervisor. What? I just graduated. What you talking about? Like, we just had this scenario, but I don't know about all that. Yeah, we're just going to give them to you because, you know, you certified to handle all this stuff. And this airman, his current supervisor for the suicide watch check would send him a meme. And if he responded LOL, yeah, he's not going to kill himself today. That was the suicide check. That was good to go. So I was happy to be a supervisor because the person that was in charge of him didn't really care. This airman went through a lot of stuff. But you wouldn't know that if you looked at him. He was the quiet guy. He cursed a lot. He had a lot of dark humor, and he said some things that should raise eyebrows, but a lot of people just laughed it off. And one time on a job, I was like, hey man, like, why you always like that? Why you always pessimistic at work? What's going on with you? And he was like, oh, I seen a lot of shit, so I gotta laugh it off. It's like, okay. It's like, listen, I don't know your pain. I really don't. But I know I've seen some things too. And what I do is I write about it. And sometimes I go to open mic and I talk about it. Because I had a supervisor that, you know, he spent time with me, not just when it was convenient for him, but anytime I needed him, and he would help me express myself through poetry. So yeah, I go to open mic and I do that. And he was like, I'm about to go to no open mic and talk about feelings. Yeah, you're right, bro. You ain't got to go. So what I did was that I invited everybody in the shop, including him. And of course, half the guys in the shop found out there was alcohol there, so they go. And we talking about it on Monday, and the airman is like, yo, so when's the next open mic? I'm like, hey, it's every month, but you don't want to go, right? He's like, well, I wrote something, so maybe I might speak. And 2 months later, this airman who was on suicide watch, nobody knew anything about, other than the fact that he's disgruntled. Nobody likes to work with him because he's quiet, pessimistic. He gets on stage in front of a bunch of strangers that he doesn't know. He tells us about how he doesn't love his mom. You know how mad you got to be at your mother to say, I don't love my mom, that I hate my mom? I've heard it, like, yeah, I hate my dad, but I hate my mom? To talk about the sexual assault that he's been through, the fact that he's an A1C sending money home to his little sister, but his grandma isn't giving the money to his little sister. Nobody in shop knows that. Nobody gave him the opportunity. Nobody asked him what's wrong. No one asked him, why are you acting this way? It's just, hey, he's different. I'm not trying to talk to him. But the fact that I cared just a little bit, I gave him a little bit of my time, and I reciprocated vulnerability, I was able to connect to this airman. And the cool thing about being an ALS instructor is that the curriculum doesn't change too much. So when we get to the lessons about diversity and emergent leadership issues, I always bring up this airman, and it just prompts me to check on him. And he checks on me too. He's doing great to this day. He still writes poetry. He still writes his feelings out. He still goes to mental health. He still does all of these things. And we talk all the time about our interactions. And I think it's amazing that just because my supervisor did that to me, I was able to echo the same thing to some random guy that I was forced to be in charge of. But instead of looking at him as a task, I looked at him as someone I get to love. And I use the word love because I feel like we only associate that with a romantic sense or somebody that we've known for a long time. But I think in the Air Force, the beautiful thing about what we go through is we're forced to have a second family. And it's truly love is what was expected of us, but we don't look at it like that. So I looked at this grown man. He's not a kid, even though the trauma that he experienced was from being a child and it's carried along with him. I loved him. I loved him. My friends loved him. My wife loved him. And I think that's part of the reason why he's alive today. And it's definitely a reason why I'm alive today, because my supervisor, who only had to rate me on a piece of paper once a year, cared about me. He gave me his time and he reciprocated vulnerability, ultimately loving me. And I think that is something worth talking about and worth adding to the conversation, is loving the people around us, being human around the people around us, and finding an outlet for those people. And I like to talk about Terry Crews a lot, not only because I intermittent fast like he does, but Terry Crews is a huge guy. He's into fitness and bodybuilding, but his son is not. And he talks about this. You can find it on YouTube. But his son is not into fitness like he is. He's into computers and games and things like that. So what Terry Crews do? Did he force him to work out and do sports? No, he learned how to build computers so that way he can connect to his son. So just taking some time to connect to your airman or connect to that person to your left or your right could make a huge difference in somebody else's life. And what is it? It's not really an inconvenience to you to be human. I mean, we feel like it is, but it really isn't. And just by me taking the time during a couple jobs talking to this airman, I feel like I helped save his life.
Man, that was awesome. Awesome. I appreciate it. I mean, vulnerability, love. I mean, everything that you talked about there, mental health, suicide awareness. I mean, so many messages in there in that speech. So definitely appreciate it. I know you recently did a Tedx talk. We'll talk about your album here in just a minute, but you're doing a lot of amazing things. This was a no-brainer to have you on here, and I knew you would deliver just like you did. But talk to us about, one of a really good coping mechanism is whether it's journaling, written poetry, what have you. Talk about the power of pen to paper.
I feel like that pen, or for those who type out everything, because a lot of my poems are typed out, it's hard for me to put this in words, and it's kind of like a paradox as a poet, but when you talk about it to somebody else, you automatically feel a little bit better, just getting it off your chest. But when you write it out, it's kind of like talking to somebody else, but it's a guarantee you're not going to be judged, because there's no echo from it, right? And then you can write it out and you can see it. And if that's not exactly how you feel, you can change it. But if I say something to somebody else, I have to go back and be like, okay, cool, that's not exactly what I meant, or I meant more than that. So definitely writing it out, you can say it any way you want. You can describe it as crazy as you need to, because it might not make sense. And one thing I love to do is describe, I don't know, colors as feelings, like red is so loud and so angry, or something, saying something like that kind of helps you express what you need to express. You can go back and edit it later if it doesn't make sense, but still, like at that time, just writing it out is a good start. And I don't recommend leaving it around anywhere or sending it to anybody, but definitely writing it out just to get your feelings out of your head helps a lot. Because I was told by old commander I have that if you have a bunch of ideas that you never write down, then they're just a dream. And if you have too many dreams and you never live them, then they're just illusions. And if you have too many illusions, well then, yeah, you're just going to drive yourself insane. And with that mindset, I was like, okay, cool. And I need to write down, what comes to my mind. I need to speak it. I need to talk about it. And just pen to paper, thumb the keyboard, whatever you want to call it. It just helps for me. And I'll say, it does not replace therapy. It does not replace the human interaction, but it's better than just sitting and letting your thoughts bounce off the wall and come right back into your head. That's what I've learned.
Speaking of dreams, tell our audience, especially those who, for whatever reason, are unfamiliar with the awesome stuff you're doing, about where they can find like your TED Talk, your album. Talk to us a little bit about the stuff you're doing.
Okay, cool. It's a little plug. Okay, so I published a book recently, and it's a poetry book. It's a poetry collection. I broke it up into chapters based off of love, heartbreak, individuality, depression, and then change. And it's called Before the Streetlights Come On. And because while I was writing these poems, I had like a nostalgic feel about it. And being home before the streetlights come on is something that is like one of my fondest memories from my grandparents, from my parents. So that's why I named it. So each chapter has something nostalgic, and it might not be nostalgic for you, but it definitely was for me. Something as simple as playing the music in the background while you're trying to record your voicemail. That's one of the chapters. But based off of that, I created a scholarship back in my old alma mater high school. So it's $250 to a graduating senior who is aspiring to be an English major, or they're a writer or a poet. They just have to answer an essay that I ask, and then I'm on the review board. I select the winner, and they get $250. They don't have to use it towards school. They can use it towards whatever they want. There's other criteria based off of their GPA and community service hours, and they just get that $250. And from the book sales is where the money is being raised, and that $250 goes to them. They get a signed copy of the book, and that, if you guys were to buy the book, that's where some of the money goes. And this is my way of giving back to the community that helped inspire me to start writing, because I had great English teachers in high school. The other thing that I did was create an album. Mainly, most of the tracks are from the book. And that album is called A Breath of Fresh Air. You can find my album and the book on freshlinencreates.com for the book, as well as the album, or you can go on any music streaming platform to find my album, A Breath of Fresh Air. And a lot of people don't know this, but I'm gonna share this with you, Trip, because you're dope. Spoken word artists actually share the Grammy category with audiobooks. So there's a push from spoken word poets who are in the Grammy Recording Academy to get our own category. So they pushed out in May for, I think about May or April, for spoken word poets to submit their album to the Grammys, because if we had 100 spoken word albums, we'll get our own category. It'd be the 87th category. So I don't know if we got it, but I submitted my album through JIV. He submitted on my behalf. So for those who listen to Kanye West's first album, you probably know who JIV is, or you watch Def Jam Poetry, you've seen him on there. He submitted my album to the Grammys. So we'll find out November 23rd if I'm nominated. But either way, please, you can just listen to my album. It's a lot of vulnerability in there. And yeah, a lot of those poems that are in the album are also in the book. So if you want a preview of what the book is like, you can listen to the album before you buy it. And the other thing was, you mentioned it too, my TEDx. I had the opportunity to perform at Tedx University of Essex in 2020 as pretty much intermission as a poet. And then I auditioned at the end of 2020 to be a speaker, and I got it. So pretty much what you guys heard in this podcast is what I talked about in my TEDx speech. And you can go find that on Tedx University of Essex, or even type in George Lennon TEDx and it'll pop up, because my TEDx is actually on the TEDx, the official TEDx page. There's probably something else I'm missing. My wife keeps better track of what I got going on than I do.
You make me feel like I'm doing nothing with my life. You made me feel like I'm doing absolutely nothing.
And you're doing
album,
a podcast,
books, Grammys, TEDx. I have a podcast and I teach.
That's dope. The people you've had on this podcast are amazing. So I see a lot of things that people are like, man, like one day I want to do that. And I'm like, okay, well, how do I do it? I literally Google everything. I'm like, all right, how do I do it? And if it seems impossible, well, I'm like, all right, cool, I'm gonna try it anyway. I recorded an album in my apartment with a baby crying and my landlord doing construction. Whether it's good or not, I tried it.
Don't podcast. You'll run me off.
Nah,
you can't podcast.
You got the juice, man.
You podcast, I'm coming after your album. Push my own album out. Well, talk to us too about what book recommendation would you recommend for those people out there?
So thanks for asking. Mental health has been a huge thing for me, like I said before. And I talked to my parents about how we grew up in a household where their children could not voice their opinion. They could not voice their feelings without being contested or challenged, without being accepted. And I realized that there was a lot of expectations that I was trying to meet constantly. I also realized that I am spending way too much time on social media. And a lot of my goals that I set were based off of social media, and I wasn't meeting a lot of those expectations, and it was adding to my depression. And I stumbled upon this book. I'm pretty sure the supervisor that I was mentioning mentioned this to me, but it's The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck by Mark Manson. And this book is written as if you were at the bar with one of your good friends and they just asked you, what's wrong? You told them what was wrong, and this whole book is their response. And it's written as if you're chilling at the bar, you're at dinner with a friend. A really easy read.
It's a good book.
But yeah, I love it. And it definitely changed my mindset. My wife doesn't like reading books, so I read her a page every once in a while, or a couple of pages, because she definitely falls into a lot of the tendencies that Mark Manson talks about in here. And I do too. And even when I feel myself falling back, I kind of reread the book or reread certain chapters that stood out to me. But I definitely recommend this book. I brought it to ALS and I was asked to take it away from ALS because of the way.
See why?
Yeah. But I definitely a lot of these teachings I'm able to tie into the lessons for sure. Yeah. And I definitely recommend that book.
Sweet. Well, yeah, we'll have links for all of this. Last question for you.
Mm-hmm.
What do you want your legacy to be 50 years from now?
What do I want my legacy to be? I want, man,
other than a Grammy.
Yeah, I know. You know how people can easily say this is a Shakespeare type thing or a Maya Angelou type thing. I want people to be like, okay, yeah, this is definitely like a Fresh Linen quote or a Fresh Linen type vibe or a Fresh Linen type movie, show, or something based off of my artwork. And I put a lot of my personality to my artwork, so I'm okay with it being based off my art, because I try not to separate the art from the artist too much. But if they could be teaching some lesson that I dropped in school intentionally 50 years from now, and hopefully I still be alive just to get a glimpse of it, that would be amazing to me, because I feel like I constantly do research. I constantly I work on my craft. I don't have a degree in anything that I do artistically, but I put a lot of work into it, and I really mean it, and it comes from the bottom of my heart. So if there was a program or something that just mentions like, hey, well, Fresh Linen, he had this philosophy, or Fresh Linen dropped this type of knowledge. He believed in this. He did this. That would be great. But one thing that I do now is Motivation Monday, or what I call is passing the juice. So every day, before we jump into work, I have either me or one of my students, they drop nuggets. Like, hey, I went through this and this is what I learned from it. Or I read this fortune cookie quote and this is what it means to me and this is how it applies to my life. And we pass the juice. After I say that, cool. It's like breakfast. You pass the juice to the next person, everybody gets to eat. That concept. I don't need my name on that concept, but that's how you live forever. You know, the way you make people feel. So if I can make people feel good and feel like they all can change the world, then I'm good with that.
Nice. Well, we're definitely going to have to get you back for a full-blown Rise from the Shadow, or excuse me, The Shadows podcast, because there's so much to unpack from your story. I thought you'd just get on here and kill it with a good episode, but then I was like, man, it's so much deeper than that. So we'll definitely have to sync you up and get you back on here for that. And kudos to you for all of our listeners out there. What time is it right now in Germany?
It is 1:12 in the morning.
He's 1:12 in the morning. He's got his little weights behind him. He's gonna get swole when he gets done with this. Now staying up doing this for us, I mean, this is awesome. I can't thank you enough. Folks, that is going to conclude this episode, Rise from the Shadows. Hey, Shadows listeners, if you're looking to make some extra income that also impacts people, then you need to look at becoming a certified leadership coach with Giant. If you don't already know, Giant has been in the leadership space for over 13 years. I got certified through Giant in 2018, and I've been teaching ever since. Just to give you some context, they used to own and operate the John Maxwell brands. They ran the LeaderCast conferences where Jim Collins, Henry Cloud, Malcolm Gladwell, and Simon Sinek, just to name a few, were regular speakers. They have over 500 coaches worldwide, working in over 127 countries, and are being hired by companies like Google, Chick-fil-A, Pfizer, Delta, and more. And yes, you can do this too. I know this might sound intimidating, but Giant will literally give you everything you need to start your own coaching business from scratch. You get hands-on training from top-level coaches to learn the exact methodology and tools that six-figure coaches are using. You get an all-in-one online platform to run your entire coaching business, even if you want to work 100% remotely. And you'll get to join a thriving community of coaches from all around the world. To get started, Giant is hosting a coaching business workshop to help you learn the ins and outs of how to build a successful coaching business. This is both for experienced coaches, consultants, and those who are looking to start coaching and consulting with little to no experience. If you want to hear the really good news, this whole workshop, it's free, 100% free. And you can reserve your spot by going to giant.tv/shadows. Why not give it a shot? What's better than making a positive change in people's lives and making some extra money in the process? Giant launches a new hiring cohort every month. Now, they only have 20 coaching slots available each month, so it's first come, first serve. So go ahead and make sure you reserve your spot. If you're ready to make an impact and get paid doing it, go to giant.tv/shadows, giant.tv/shadows.